The drums of Ogidigbo did not merely beat, they commanded the earth itself to tremble. Every child's laughter carried the echo of ancient spirits, while the elders leaned on their carved staffs and smiled through cracked teeth. The masquerades leapt into the air with painted faces and raffia skirts, their movements both terrifying and comic. Tourists snapped photos. Villagers clapped until palms stung. Yet beneath the thunder of celebration lay a whisper of unease, too faint for the untrained ear. For this was not just a festival. It was a stage where wealth danced, and guilt hid in plain sight. Palm wine flowed freely, poured into calabashes that overflowed like the oil that once poisoned the rivers. Women balanced steaming pots of jollof on their heads, while children raced barefoot through dust that clung to their laughter. Chiefs strutted in egbadas embroidered with gold, their coral beads shining like miniature suns. Yet for all the glitter, a strange hollowness lingered. The masquerade's dance was wild, but the eyes inside the mask were weary. Even the carved ancestral drums seemed to mutter warnings, their rhythms echoing secrets too ancient to ignore. Suspense hung, disguised as merriment. Chief Oba Kazim sat in a grand chair carved from Morocco wood, towering above the crowd like a king over pawns. His egbada shimmered with white and blue embroidery, his face painted with a smile polished for public eyes. Women ululated, elders bowed, and children scattered petals before him. To the villagers, he was the custodian of their pride. To himself, he was a prisoner of his own oath. Each drumbeat was a reminder of the silence he had sold in London, a silence that bought him mansions but robbed him of sleep. Beneath his coral beads, his chest tightened. There was humour in the air too, sharp as palm wine. A masquerade tripped over his raffia skirt, sending the crowd roaring with laughter. A goat, painted with chalk, broke free from its tether and chased after children who squealed like startled parrots. Vendors argued over the price of suya, their voices rising above the flutes, while a drunken uncle declared himself the reincarnation of Shango. The crowd's mirth was genuine, yet even laughter seemed forced, as though every chuckle was covering a wound. In the heart of Ogidigbo, humour had become a plaster laid on rotting wood. The festival, for all its colour, was also a mirror of contradiction. Marble mansions loomed in the background, their windows glittering like diamonds, while beggars crouched in their shadows with bowls half empty. The crowd cheered the arrival of a fleet of jeeps, their engines growling like caged lions, yet none noticed the potholes splitting the roads beneath. Even the air itself carried contradiction. The smell of roasted meat mingled with the faint stench of crude oil. And as the masquerade spun, their eyes hidden, the villagers spun with them, trapped in a dance choreographed by forces they did not see. Every festival carried omens, but this one carried too many. A masquerade's mask cracked mid-dance, revealing the sweating face of a boy beneath. The drummers missed a beat, their rhythm stumbling for the first time in years. A hawk circled above the crowd, its shadow cutting across Kazim's face like a warning. Superstitious elders whispered that ancestors were restless, displeased by what lay buried beneath the soil. Yet the crowd ignored the signs, lost in laughter and wine. Only Chief Kazim noticed the weight of it, for he knew the ground itself was heavy with secrets waiting to surface. He lifted his goblet of palm wine, forcing a smile that stretched thinner than the silk on his egbada. Every sip was bitter. The cheers of the villagers felt like chains clinking against his ears. Each masquerade's leap into the air reminded him of the leap he once made, decades ago, into the waiting arms of foreign hands. He pressed his lips to the goblet, but tasted only regret. A faint tremor passed through his hand, unnoticed by the crowd but seen by his ancestors. For the oath of silence was not dead, it beat inside him like a second heart. Ogidigbo was a village stitched together with contradictions. Marble mansions lined avenues where potholes grew like weeds. Electric gates swung open to reveal fountains spewing water into the sky, while nearby, women trekked miles for a single bucket. Children in imported sneakers played football in front of schools with collapsed roofs. The riverbanks smelled of rot, coated with a rainbow sheen of oil, while fishermen stared at empty nets and cursed softly. Ogidigbo's soil was rich with treasures that bought palaces, yet its people ate cassava with bitter leaves. Wealth poured like a river, but it flowed into the wrong mouths. The jeeps roared daily, their tires crushing dust into clouds that coated hawkers and children alike. Politicians, businessmen, and foreign contractors feasted at long tables while villagers peered from outside, their stomachs growling. Hospitals gleamed with new paint but hid empty shelves where medicine should have been. Even funerals carried contradictions. Golden coffins lowered into graves dug by men too poor to afford shoes. The people laughed loudly, but behind closed doors they whispered, wondering how their land, once rich with palm wine and yams, had become cursed. They did not know curses were often written in contracts, not chance. Suspicion simmered, but never quite boiled over. Elders muttered about spirits angered by greed, while the youth whispered about theft wrapped in egbadas. Some believed the land itself was punishing them, that the poisoned rivers were ancestral tears. Others joked bitterly that Ogidigbo's gods had been bribed with jeeps. Humour became survival, a way to laugh at starvation, to turn curses into comedy. Yet the laughter never lasted long. Every time a child coughed from polluted air, every time a mother walked miles for water, the humour soured, leaving only bitterness. Something unseen held the people back, binding tongues in silence. And at the centre of that silence stood Chief Oba Kazim. To many, he was their pride, the custodian who had brought investors and light. But to a few, he was the shadow in their prosperity. He wore coral beads and flowing robes, but the weight he carried was heavier than any regalia. He walked through marble halls at night, haunted not by ghosts of the dead, but by contracts written in ink that never faded. His wealth was proof of his silence, and his silence was the villagers' suffering. The soil was rich, but so was the guilt buried in it. Night in Ogidigbo was never fully dark. Flares from distant oil rigs painted the sky in unnatural shades of orange, like a permanent sunset that refused to fade. The rivers reflected this glow, shimmering with the greasy skin of crude oil. Children slept with coughs rattling their chests, while elders told tales of a time when fish leapt from clear waters. The wealth beneath the soil seemed endless, yet it turned the heavens into fire and the rivers into poison. Ogidigbo was rich, but its people were poorer than ever. The soil had become both blessing and curse, a silent tyrant. Every morning, women in wrappers tied babies to their backs and walked through streets where mansions glittered like palaces of foreign kings. They carried buckets on their heads, stepping over broken bottles and the dust kicked up by passing jeeps. Their laughter was sharp, filled with irony, as they joked about bathing in perfume while billionaires swam in imported pools. The gap between palace and hut widened daily, not just in wealth but in spirit. Yet no one confronted the truth openly. Fear hung over the people like a mosquito net, thin, transparent, and suffocating. Their silence was not by choice. The silence carried its own rhythm. At community meetings, elders praised Kazim with practiced voices, while mothers kept quiet, holding back their anger like a pot threatening to boil over. The youth muttered in corners, their fists clenched, but their voices muffled. Everyone knew something was wrong, yet no one dared to name it aloud. Silence became survival, a shield against punishment that never needed to be announced. The people of Ogidigbo moved like dancers in a masquerade. They smiled, they cheered, but behind the painted faces was fear. Only a few dared wonder who had stolen their tongues. Chief Kazim, in his marble mansion, often watched the village through tall windows framed with velvet curtains. He saw both the beauty and the decay, and though his chest swelled with pride at what he had built, his heart throbbed with unease. Each jeep that roared past his gate was a reminder of the deal he had struck, the silence he had sworn. He would touch his beads absent-mindedly, each coral piece like a bead of guilt strung tightly around his neck. Ogidigbo adored him, yet he could never meet his reflection in the mirror without flinching. He knew the truth. The memory often returned uninvited, vivid as the scent of old paper. London, cold and grey, with rain tapping against the windows of a dimly lit office. Young Kazim sat upright, his hands trembling slightly as the foreign man slid the Bible across the table. The office smelled of leather chairs, cigar smoke, and polished wood. He remembered the weight of the silence in that room, heavier than the Bible itself. The man spoke of opportunity, of wealth beyond imagination, of Ogidigbo's rise. But beneath the words was a contract, a trap disguised as destiny. Kazim signed with trembling resolve. The oath was simple in wording yet complex in consequence. In exchange for contracts, connections, and wealth, Kazim swore not to oppose or expose the corporations that bled Ogidigbo's land dry. His silence was bought and sealed with his palm pressed against Holy Scripture. In that moment, he believed it was honor disguised as sacrifice, progress dressed as compromise. Yet the oath was more than paper and ink. It became chains that followed him home. He returned to Ogidigbo not just with wealth, but with an invisible leash around his soul, tethered to promises made far from ancestral soil. Kazim's first years under the oath seemed glorious. Mansions rose, roads were paved, and jeeps multiplied like locusts. He was praised as visionary, the custodian who brought light where there was darkness. Yet beneath the celebration, cracks began to show. The rivers grew more poisoned, the farms more barren, the people more restless. Each smile he offered at festivals concealed a tightening noose around his spirit. He began to realize that silence was not neutral. It was violence in disguise. The oath he thought would bring progress was feeding on his people's lifeblood, while he stood as its guardian. At night, the memory of that London office replayed in fragments. The way the foreign man's eyes never blinked, the way the pen felt heavier than iron, the way the Bible seemed to sigh beneath his palm. He remembered thinking he was making history, yet every echo of laughter in Ogidigbo now reminded him he was making chains. His guilt grew sharper with each passing year, for the oath was not only a vow, it was a curse. One that demanded silence even as children starved and rivers choked. And though decades passed, Kazim knew the oath had never aged a day. The villagers saw wealth everywhere but felt poverty in their bones. They marveled at new mansions, but their stomachs rumbled with hunger. They clapped at the arrival of jeeps, but their feet blistered on broken roads. The contradictions became so ordinary that people learned to laugh at them. A beggar joked that the potholes were deep enough to hide secrets. Another claimed even ghosts paid rent in marble houses. Humor became the language of pain, a way to survive the absurd. Yet laughter could not heal empty stomachs. Slowly, the price of silence revealed itself in illness, hunger, and despair. Hospitals stood like palaces of healing but echoed with empty shelves. Mothers walked in with sick children only to leave with prayers instead of medicine. Schools, once proud centers of knowledge, crumbled into ruins where chalk dust mixed with rainwater. Teachers taught beneath leaking roofs, their words drowned by dripping water. Fishermen returned from poisoned rivers with empty nets, while farmers cursed the soil that no longer obeyed them. All the while, Chief Kazim presided with regal calm, offering donations that sparkled but healed nothing. His silence was their silence, and his wealth was their suffering. The oath consumed everything. The villagers whispered among themselves, their voices trembling with fear. Some believed Kazim had made a pact with spirits, trading Ogidigbo's fortune for his own. Others believed he was bewitched, unable to see the suffering around him. Rumors grew wild, each tale darker than the last, but none dared say them aloud near his compound. Silence had become law, unspoken yet absolute. Even the land seemed bound by it. When the rains came late and the harvest failed, villagers claimed the soil itself had taken the oath. Ogidigbo's silence was no longer human. It had become ancestral, generational, eternal. And Kazim bore the weight of it. He sat on his throne at festivals, surrounded by praise, yet inside he was hollow. The leaflets of contracts and shipments haunted him in dreams, each page turning into a child's hungry face. He tried to bury the guilt with gifts, donations to schools, offerings at shrines, lavish feasts during festivals, but nothing satisfied. Every masquerade's dance looked like a funeral march to him, every drumbeat like a dirge. Silence echoed louder than the drums of Ogidigbo, and Kazim felt it pressing down on him like the weight of the Iroko tree itself. In the crumbling classroom at the edge of the village, Nnenna stood like a flame refusing to be extinguished. She was young, her eyes bright with stubborn fire, her voice carrying authority even without shouting. The chalk in her hand broke often, for the blackboard was cracked and pitted like the village itself. Yet she taught with passion, weaving stories of ancestors and arithmetic into lessons that made children lean forward eagerly. The roof leaked, the desks creaked, and lizards skittered across the walls, but Nnenna's presence was unshaken. She carried both defiance and hope, a dangerous combination in Ogidigbo. It was in this ruined classroom that she stumbled upon the truth. Hidden among donated books was a folder, its spine dusty, its pages yellowed with neglect. At first glance, it looked like dull paperwork, but the numbers whispered secrets. Shipment records, foreign contracts, signatures that linked Chief Kazim to companies draining the land. The dates aligned with the decline of the rivers, the collapse of the farms, the hunger in the children's eyes. Nnenna felt her hands tremble as she pieced it together. The poverty was not a curse from the ancestors. It was betrayal written in neat ink. The discovery lit a fire inside her. She began scribbling notes on scraps of paper, her handwriting sharp and urgent. At night, by lantern light, she copied documents, tracing each signature with a finger that trembled with anger. She hid the pages in tins beneath her bed, whispering prayers that they would not be found. Curiosity consumed her, but so did fear. For every secret she uncovered, she knew the oath grew sharper, like a blade watching from the shadows. Yet she could not stop. Silence had ruled Ogidigbo for too long, and Nnenna was determined to crack it open. Her whispers began in the classroom, disguised as lessons. She spoke of justice, of truth, of ancestors who fought for dignity. Her students carried these whispers home, repeating them to their parents with the innocence of children. Soon, the whispers spread like smoke through the village. Mothers repeated them at wells, fathers muttered them over drinks, youths chanted them in secret corners. The silence that once bound Ogidigbo began to fray, thread by thread. And though the villagers did not yet know her name, Nnenna was planting seeds of defiance, seeds that would one day shake Kazim's empire. By night, Nnenna became a shadow. In her small room, with the hiss of a kerosene lamp and the creak of ceiling boards above her, she turned her findings into weapons. Each leaflet was a blade of truth, written in simple words so even children could understand. She wrote of poisoned rivers, of stolen wealth, of contracts that bound silence. The paper was cheap, the ink smudged, yet the words burned brighter than fire. She folded each page with trembling fingers, whispering that they carried not just words but ancestors' rage. Ogidigbo's silence was finally being translated into print. The first leaflets appeared like fallen leaves after a storm. In markets, on doorsteps, under rocks where children played, word spread faster than gossip. Villagers found them at dawn, their hearts thundering as they read. Some trembled, others laughed nervously, but all felt the shift. For the first time, the silence of Ogidigbo cracked. People gathered in corners, their voices hushed but urgent, debating what had long been forbidden to speak. Each leaflet felt like forbidden fruit, sweet and dangerous. Nnenna walked among them during the day, calm and unnoticed, hiding the storm she had unleashed beneath her simple dress. The chiefs fumed quietly, their beads clinking angrily as they whispered behind compound walls. They dismissed the papers as childish nonsense, yet fear lurked in their eyes. 4 words had power, and leaflets multiplied like locusts. Who had written them? Who dared challenge silence? The questions spread faster than answers. Suspicion turned neighbor against neighbor, and the air thickened with tension. Each festival meeting now carried unease, each chant of praise shadowed by doubt. Nnenna's words had become wildfire, unstoppable, consuming the dry silence that had smothered the village for decades. Ogidigbo was awake, and it would not sleep easily again. Kazim read the leaflets in private, his hands trembling though his face remained stone. Each sentence was a wound, exposing secrets he had buried beneath decades of wealth and ceremony. He burned the papers in silence, but the smoke filled his compound with the stench of betrayal. His mind replayed London's oath, the ink on the contract, the weight of his palm pressed against the Bible. Now those secrets had faces, words, and wings. He feared not the villagers' anger, but the unraveling of silence itself. For silence, once broken, could not be repaired. It spread like cracks in glass. It happened on a night when the moon hung low, swollen and yellow, as though watching with suspicion. Nnenna did not return home. Her friends searched the paths, calling softly into the darkness, but the wind carried only the rustle of palm fronds. At dawn, fishermen found her at the riverbank, her body half submerged, her leaflets scattered across the mud like feathers torn from a bird. The river, once a source of life, now carried her silence. The villagers wailed, but their cries carried not just grief, but terror. For truth had been drowned, and silence reclaimed its throne. Her death was wrapped in mystery, no less poisonous than the rivers. Some whispered it was an accident, that she had slipped on the slick bank. Others claimed she was murdered, sacrificed to the oath. Her body bore no wounds, yet her lifeless eyes told of struggle. The leaflets lay wet but legible, their ink bleeding into the soil as though eager to sink deeper, to tattoo the earth itself. Mothers wailed, youths clenched fists, elders muttered about angry spirits. But none spoke openly. Silence descended heavier than ever, sharpened now with fear. Ogidigbo returned to its familiar prison of quiet. The riverbank became a shrine. Villagers placed flowers there, whispered prayers, left palm wine as offering. Children avoided it, afraid of ghosts, while women lingered longer, staring at the water as if expecting it to answer. Even the fishermen cast their nets with trembling hands, wary of dragging up more than fish. The river had swallowed Nnenna's body, but it had not swallowed her words. Her leaflets, dried and smeared, continued to circulate. Each page felt like a ghost, whispering rebellion from beyond the grave. In death, Nnenna had become more dangerous than she ever was in life. Chief Kazim stood in the mortuary, staring at her face one last time. She looked peaceful, almost mocking, as though she knew her death was not an ending. He felt his chest tighten, not with grief, but with recognition. In her stillness, he saw every ancestor he had betrayed, every child left hungry, every river poisoned. Her death was his mirror. The oath had given him power, yet here lay the cost, cold and silent. He touched her forehead briefly, but his hand recoiled as if burned. The oath weighed heavier than ever, and its silence was deafening. The village returned to its rhythm, but nothing was the same. Festivals still came, drums still beat, jeeps still roared, yet the air tasted different. Whispers now carried edge and urgency. Mothers no longer smiled as easily. Youths lingered longer in corners, their eyes bright with quiet rebellion. The silence of Ogidigbo was cracked, and though Nnenna's body lay in the ground, her voice hovered like smoke above the rooftops. Chief Kazim walked through his compound surrounded by guards, yet he felt more alone than ever. For the oath he had sworn in London was no longer his secret alone. Nnenna's leaflets, though damp and torn, resurfaced again and again, as if multiplying by themselves. Farmers found them in fields, fishermen tucked them under nets, traders folded them into baskets. Each page became a relic, passed like contraband, preserved as prophecy. Fear and curiosity twisted together, binding the villagers in suspense. Something was coming, though no one could name it. The oath of silence had been rattled, and now it echoed through every home, every market, every festival drumbeat. Ogidigbo waited, suspended between reverence and rebellion. And deep beneath the soil, secrets stirred, impatient for the day they would erupt. The death of Nnenna did not just silence the village, it tore a hole in its very spirit. Her funeral was unlike any in living memory. Women wailed until their throats cracked, and men stood in heavy silence, their faces carved with grief they dared not name. Her coffin was simple, but the air around it felt electric, charged with something unseen. The river that had taken her seemed to mock the people, its poisoned waters glinting under the sun. Whispers spread like smoke. Her death was no accident. The oath had claimed its first visible sacrifice. The procession wound through cracked roads, past mansions with tinted windows that remained closed. No chief appeared, no wealthy man joined. Only villagers walked, barefoot, carrying their sorrow as though it were another coffin. Children stared at the ground, sensing the weight of an injustice they could not yet name. Drummers played slowly, each beat heavy, like footsteps into the grave. But even the drums sounded hesitant, as though afraid of summoning what lay beneath the soil. Suspense thickened with every thud, for the people mourned not just Nnenna, but the part of themselves that had dared to hope. That night, silence covered Ogidigbo like a suffocating blanket. No laughter, no music, no hum of celebration. The air smelled of palm wine left unfinished, of smoke from extinguished lamps. Elders gathered in secret, muttering about omens, about ancestors angered beyond appeasement. Youths clenched fists in the dark, their eyes red with more than tears. Mothers pressed children tightly to their chests, whispering lullabies that faltered halfway. Ogidigbo was not just grieving, it was waiting. The ground itself felt restless, the trees bent strangely in the wind. Something was gathering, invisible yet undeniable, and it terrified those who sensed it coming. The next festival came, but the drums refused to sing. They beat, yes, but their rhythm was broken, hesitant, like hearts unsure of themselves. Masquerades danced clumsily, their steps faltering, their movements awkward. The crowd clapped, but the sound was thin, hollow, stripped of its former joy. Laughter sounded more like mockery than mirth. Even palm wine tasted bitter, as though soured by grief. Humor, once Ogidigbo's shield, turned sharp and cutting. Young men joked that jeeps should be sacrificed to appease the ancestors, while women laughed that marble mansions could not cook soup. The satire spread, biting and dangerous. The chiefs still paraded in gold-threaded egbadas, but their beads clinked nervously. Behind their smiles, fear flickered like lanterns in the wind. They sensed the shift but refused to name it, for naming it would give it life. Instead, they praised Kazim more loudly, their voices cracked with forced devotion. Yet even as they sang, the villagers' eyes betrayed disbelief. Whispers replaced chants, smirks replaced cheers. Ogidigbo's silence had not vanished, it had mutated. It was no longer submission but resistance in disguise. Each drumbeat, though broken, carried rebellion in its stutter. The silence was cracking, and everyone knew it. Songs began to change. Once, they praised the land, the chiefs, the ancestors. Now, verses slipped into satire, hidden in riddles. Children chanted rhymes that mocked jeeps and palaces, their innocent voices carrying rebellion without knowing it. Women sang at riversides, weaving humor into sorrow, laughter into accusation. Men hummed tunes in bars that turned into protests disguised as jokes. Humor became weapon, satire became shield. Kazim's name was never spoken directly, yet his shadow lingered in every note. The drums, though hesitant, had given birth to a new rhythm, the rhythm of discontent. And that rhythm was impossible to silence. Kazim's nights grew darker than his days. Sleep no longer came easily. When it did, it brought visions. He dreamed of rivers flowing red, of ancestors rising from graves, their faces stern and unblinking. He saw oil bubbling from the ground like blood, seeping into his coral beads, staining his egbada. He would wake drenched in sweat, clutching his chest as though to hold his heart in place. His compound was filled with guards, yet he felt more unsafe than ever. For his enemies were no longer just men. They were ancestors, spirits, memories, and the silent soil itself. The dreams refused to stop. In one, he saw Nnenna standing at the riverbank, holding her leaflets like torches, her face pale and luminous. She did not speak, but her silence screamed louder than words. In another, he stood in London again, the Bible heavy under his palm, but this time the ink on the contract turned into blood, dripping onto the polished floor. His ancestors stood behind him, their eyes burning with disappointment. Every dream ended the same way, with silence so loud it crushed him awake. Kazim feared the dead more than the living. His oath had summoned them. Word spread quickly about Kazim's haunted nights. Servants whispered of him shouting in his sleep, of lamps left burning till dawn, of rituals performed in secret corners of his compound. Elders pretended not to notice, but rumors seeped into the village. People began to believe the ancestors themselves were rejecting him, punishing him for his betrayal. Superstition and rebellion intertwined, each feeding the other. Some swore they saw strange shadows in the compound. Others claimed birds circled above it at night. The people were terrified, but also emboldened. If the ancestors were against Kazim, who could protect him now? The first sign came when leaflets appeared again, weeks after Nnenna's burial. No one knew who had printed them, yet they spread like wildfire. This time, they bore stains of mud and water, as though pulled from the river itself. Villagers whispered that Nnenna's spirit was still working, her voice carried on paper by unseen hands. Kazim's guards tore them down, burned them in heaps, but new ones appeared by morning. The leaflets became both rebellion and haunting. The silence that Kazim had sworn decades ago was now shredded, not by men, but by a ghost who refused to stay buried. Meetings grew larger. Villagers gathered in secret, their numbers swelling despite fear. Farmers left fields early, fishermen docked boats before dusk, all to attend whispers of resistance. The air buzzed with courage disguised as caution. People spoke of building again, not mansions but truth, not jeeps but justice. Yet every gathering carried risk. Guards patrolled, eyes sharp, ears sharper. Men disappeared in the night, their families left to mourn in silence. But even intimidation could not kill the fire. Every arrest was a drumbeat, every disappearance a song. The walls of silence, once impenetrable, were now splitting with cracks. Kazim's mansion became a fortress. Gates locked earlier, guards doubled their patrols, rituals multiplied. Yet his isolation betrayed him. Allies who once bowed began to doubt. Friends grew distant, their smiles thinner, their visits shorter. Even his family whispered behind closed doors. The weight of suspicion grew heavier than coral beads. He tried to reassure them with gifts, money, lavish meals, but generosity smelled of desperation. And still the leaflets arrived. Once, Kazim woke to find one slipped under his own door, its words circled in red ink. His silence was no longer protection. It had become his loudest accusation. It began with tremors. The ground shook faintly at night, rattling dishes, knocking bottles from shelves. At first, people thought it was imagination, but soon the tremors grew stronger. Windows cracked, walls groaned, and the river overflowed. Some claimed it was oil drilling. Others swore it was the ancestors pounding their staffs. Fear swept the village, but with it came resolve. If even the soil had turned against Kazim, then the people had nothing left to fear. Crowds gathered at his gates, unarmed but unyielding, their chants rising like thunder. The silence of Ogidigbo had ended, not with words, but with roar. Kazim stood at his balcony, staring at the masses below. Their faces burned with anger, with hunger, with ancestral fire. He raised his hands, but the chants drowned him out. The ground trembled again, cracking tiles beneath his feet. The air smelled of storm, of oil, of blood. For the first time, Kazim felt the oath press against his chest, crushing, suffocating. He realized then that silence could not last forever. It always erupted, whether through leaflets, rebellion, or the ground itself. Ogidigbo's silence had turned into scream, and it was louder than any drum. The oath was unraveling. The storm broke. Rain poured, wind howled, the river surged, and the villagers surged with it. They stormed gates, broke walls, tore symbols of wealth apart. Jeeps were overturned, mansions desecrated, idols smashed. Yet it was not mere chaos. It was ritual, revenge shaped as justice. The people shouted, but their voices carried the weight of ancestors. Kazim fell to his knees inside his compound, clutching his chest, staring at the cracks spreading across the marble floor. He understood then. The ground would not forgive. The soil would not forget. His oath had not silenced his people. It had only delayed their thunder. And as the storm raged, one truth lingered above all. Silence was never silence. It was a scream buried alive, clawing at the earth until it broke free. Nnenna's voice, the ancestors' rage, the villagers' hunger, all converged into one unstoppable roar. Ogidigbo would never be the same. The oath of silence had bought palaces and beads, but its price was doom. And now, the debt was paid in full.